What if your heart already begins to change within the first minutes of a walk, long before you even feel like you're exercising? Most people believe that walking is always good for the heart. A few steps here, a short walk there, and that's enough. But biology sees it differently. For the heart, there is no magical moment that is the same for everyone. What science shows instead is a critical zone, a moment in which the body realizes this is no longer random, this is a real training signal. Before this point, the heart merely reacts to movement. After this point, it begins to adapt. Blood vessels change their behavior, blood pressure responds differently, and the heart begins to learn from this load. This video is not about myths or motivation. It is about the exact biological moment at which walking provides measurable protection for your heart, scientifically explained. The heart is not a simple motor. It is a highly sensitive control center that responds around the clock to signals, to stress, emotions, hormones, and above all, to movement. At rest, it beats about 60 to 80 times per minute. Over the course of a day, it pumps several thousand liters of blood through a network of vessels that is longer than the circumference of the Earth. And yet, a large part of modern society lives as if this system were designed for stillness. Hours of sitting, hardly any real physical strain, movement reduced to short paths between chair, car, and screen. Physicians today speak of a paradoxical condition. The heart is strong enough to beat for a lifetime, but too rarely does it receive the stimulus it was evolutionarily designed for. Because from a biological perspective, walking is not exercise, it is a basic program. For hundreds of thousands of years, walking meant foraging, migration, survival. The heart evolved in a world in which regular moderate movement was the norm, not the exception. So the real question is not whether walking helps the heart, but at what point the heart stops merely reacting and begins to adapt structurally and functionally. To understand this, we have to break a walk down into time, minute by minute, and observe what actually happens in the body.
Let's imagine a simple moment. A person is sitting. The body is in energy-saving mode. The heartbeat is calm, blood pressure stable, oxygen demand low. Then movement begins. With the first steps, the muscles signal their demand. They require more oxygen, more nutrients. The heart responds immediately, but not chaotically. The autonomic nervous system takes control. The sympathetic nervous system is activated. Stress hormones like adrenaline rise slightly. Heart rate increases. Stroke volume increases. Blood is selectively redirected to the working muscles. At the same time, blood vessels in the legs dilate. Resistance decreases. Blood flow becomes more efficient. From the outside, this feels unspectacular. A slightly faster breath, a gentle sensation of warmth in the body. But biologically, this is already a test run, a controlled stress stimulus for the cardiovascular system. In these first minutes, the heart is still reacting exclusively to acute demand. It does what is necessary to enable movement, but it is not learning yet. Not yet. After about 5 minutes of continuous walking, something decisive begins to change. Up to this point, the heart has mainly reacted. It has met the increased oxygen demand, redistributed blood flow, adjusted blood pressure. But now the load remains. The body realizes this movement is no longer a short impulse. It continues. And this is exactly where the difference between movement and training begins. The cardiovascular system switches into a different mode. Control becomes finer, more economical. The heartbeat is not just faster. It becomes more coordinated. At the same time, the hormonal environment changes. Adrenaline levels stabilize. The parasympathetic nervous system begins to counterbalance, to establish equilibrium between load and control. From a physiological perspective, this is known as a metabolic warm-up phase. The body definitively leaves the resting state and establishes a new energetic rhythm. The muscles begin to use oxygen more efficiently. Mitochondria, the power plants of the cells, increase their activity. The transition between glucose and fat metabolism becomes smoother. For many people, this moment feels uncomfortable. Breathing is faster than usual, the heart is noticeably pounding, a subtle feeling of, I'm out of shape. And this is where the big trap lies. Very many walks end at this point. The body has just begun to adjust, but the movement is interrupted before the heart can register the signal as protective. Biologically speaking, the stimulus remains incomplete. The heart has reacted, but it did not have enough time to learn.
Studies on heart health repeatedly show a similar pattern. Short-term interrupted movement temporarily improves circulation, but barely reduces long-term risk. Only when the load remains continuous do measurable adaptations begin. Improved vascular responsiveness, more stable blood pressure regulation, reduced inflammatory activity within the vascular system. This is the point at which walking stops being just movement and starts training the heart. After about 10 minutes of continuous walking, the body has found its rhythm. Breathing is faster, but no longer chaotic. Heart rate is elevated, but stable. The heart is no longer operating in alarm mode, but in a controlled performance state. And this is exactly where processes begin that are repeatedly linked to heart protection in studies. One of the most important players is an inconspicuous molecule, nitric oxide. With every step, blood flow through the arteries increases. This increased flow creates a mechanical force on the vessel walls, so-called shear stress. The vessels respond by releasing nitric oxide. This molecule acts like a biological relaxant. It dilates the arteries, reduces vascular resistance, and improves blood flow to the heart muscle. A well-functioning endothelium, the inner lining of blood vessels, is considered one of the strongest protective factors against high blood pressure, arterial plaque formation, and ultimately heart attacks. And it is precisely this endothelium that is trained through sufficiently long, steady walking. Not through sprinting, not through jerky movements, but through consistent rhythmic load.
During walking, blood pressure rises slightly. This is normal and necessary. But the truly interesting part happens afterward. In the hours following a sufficiently long walk, blood pressure often drops below baseline. This phenomenon is called post-exercise hypotension. It is one of the reasons why walking is especially recommended for people with high blood pressure. The heart learns to perform the same work with less pressure, a sign of efficiency. When this stimulus is repeated regularly, the heart begins to adapt structurally. Not overnight, not after a single walk, but over weeks and months. Stroke volume increases, resting heart rate decreases, fewer heartbeats are required for the same load. You could say the heart becomes quieter, calmer, yet more powerful. This is why physically active people often have a lower resting heart rate than inactive individuals, not because their heart is weaker, but because it has learned to work efficiently. Many people believe they move enough because they move around a lot in daily life, a few steps here, a short walk there. But for the heart, this stimulus is often too weak and too fragmented. The heart needs phases in which it works noticeably above resting level and without interruption. That is exactly why the same number appears again and again in so many studies.
When looking at large population studies on heart health, one number appears repeatedly: 30 minutes. Not because it is magical, but because in practice it marks a point at which time and intensity often come together. In many studies showing a reduced risk of heart attack and stroke, participants move on most days of the week for about 30 minutes at light to moderate intensity. By this point, the heart has had enough time to enter a stable training state. The vessels respond, blood pressure shows adaptation, inflammatory markers begin to decline. Below this duration, there are benefits, but they are often less consistent and harder to measure. 30 minutes is not a goal of perfection, it is a practical reference point. But time alone is not enough. A walk can last 30 minutes and still be too gentle to trigger meaningful adaptation. That is why sports medicine uses a simple but surprisingly precise method, the so-called talk test. At the right intensity, you can still hold a conversation, but not completely effortlessly. Breathing is noticeably faster, sentences become shorter. You can tell the body is working. If walking is so easy that you can carry on long conversations without effort, the stimulus is often too weak. If it is so strenuous that hardly a word is possible, you are already close to the limit. For most people, the greatest benefit lies exactly in between. One of the most common questions is it better to walk slowly for a longer time or faster for a shorter time? Observational studies with tens of thousands of participants show a clear pattern. People who walk briskly have, on average, a lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease than those who walk very slowly. This does not mean that slow walking is useless, but it shows that intensity plays a decisive role. A brisk pace challenges the heart and vessels more without making the load explosive.
For some people, interval walking can be an interesting option. Short phases of faster walking, followed by a relaxed pace.
These alternations can create a strong cardiovascular stimulus in a shorter amount of time, provided there are no medical limitations. But here too, the rule applies. The best walking is not the theoretically most effective one, but the one that happens regularly. The critical moment, referred to at the beginning, does not lie in a single minute. It emerges from three factors: duration, intensity, repetition. When these three come together, the heart begins not just to cope with the load, but to use it.
One of the most important questions is, how do you know that the heart is not just working, but adapting? Science does not look at exhaustion or heavy sweating. It looks at subtle but reliable physiological signals. One of the earliest signs is heart rate recovery. When you stop, your pulse should drop noticeably within a few minutes. The better trained the heart is, the faster the parasympathetic nervous system takes over control. Studies show fast heart rate recovery is associated with a significantly lower risk of cardiovascular disease. After a few weeks of regular walking, something noticeable often happens. The distance stays the same, the pace stays the same, but breathing feels calmer, movement feels more controlled, you get less out of breath. This is no coincidence. It shows that heart and lungs are working more efficiently with oxygen.
Walking affects not only the heart, but also the blood vessels. Vessel walls become more elastic. Circulation improves. In many people, resting blood pressure drops slightly, or at least becomes more stable. This change is slow, but it is sustainable. The statement sounds dramatic, and it is scientifically simplified. Prolonged, uninterrupted sitting slows down important metabolic processes. Enzymes responsible for fat breakdown and blood sugar regulation become less active. Even people who exercise regularly can have an increased heart risk from hours of sitting. But sitting does not harm in the same way as smoking. The real problem is uninterrupted inactivity. Just a few minutes of standing up, walking, or light stretching can have measurable effects. Blood sugar responds better, circulation improves, metabolism remains active. This is not about training. It is about breaking the state of complete inactivity. The decisive moment is not a single point on the clock. It arises when three factors come together: duration, intensity, regularity. From this point on, the heart does not just react, but learns.
Walking is not extreme training, but that is exactly what makes it so powerful. If it lasts long enough, if it is brisk enough, and if it happens regularly, then the heart begins to protect itself quietly and measurably. The most important point in this topic may not be how many steps you take, but when your body begins to take those steps seriously. Not every movement is training, and not every effort produces adaptation. But when duration, intensity, and regularity come together, the heart recognizes a clear signal. It becomes more efficient, more resilient, and better protected. Not through extreme measures, but through something that almost everyone can do. Walking is not a substitute for movement. Walking is movement in its most sustainable form. It is quiet, it is repeatable, and that is exactly why it works. The next time you go for a walk, don't just pay attention to the distance. Pay attention to your pace, to your breathing, to the moment when walking stops being random and begins to become a stimulus for your heart. Not the first step protects your heart, but the moment your body decides to adapt.